The jungle was so quiet you could hear the rain hitting the leaves one drop at a time, and that silence was the first thing that told him something was very, very wrong. Private First Class Daniel Harmon pressed his back against the mud wall of his foxhole, his rifle resting across his knees, and he listened. Not a bird, not an insect, not a single sound from the thick, black jungle that surrounded him on all sides, and in the Pacific, that kind of silence meant one thing. The enemy was close. It was the summer of 1944, somewhere on a chain of small islands that most Americans back home had never heard of, and Harmon was alone. His squad had been hit hard the night before, torn apart by a mortar barrage that came out of nowhere and turned their position into a crater full of broken men and broken equipment. And by the time the smoke cleared, Harmon was the only one who could still hold a weapon. He was wounded too, though, and badly. A piece of shrapnel had torn through his left side, cracking 2 ribs and leaving a wound that bled no matter how tight he wrapped it, and a bullet had clipped his right thigh just hard enough to make every movement feel like someone was pressing a hot iron into his leg. He couldn't run. He could barely stand. But he could still shoot, and in this war, in this place, that was sometimes enough. If you want to hear stories like this one every single week, stories of ordinary men doing things that should have been impossible, hit that subscribe button right now, because what this one man did in the next 12 hours is going to change the way you think about what a single person is capable of under pressure. What happened to Daniel Harmon that night became one of the most talked about stories in the entire Marine Corps, not because someone wrote it up in a fancy report or because a general gave a speech about it, but because the men who found him the next morning could barely believe what they were looking at when they pushed through that jungle and stumbled into his position. 87 Japanese soldiers had come to kill him, and every single one of them ended up dead before the sun came up. Harmon did it with 9 bullets, and not a single one of those bullets missed its mark. What followed that night was a display of marksmanship and tactical thinking so cold and so calculated that it didn't just save one wounded Marine's life. It destroyed an entire attacking force, and it did it in a way that nobody in the Corps had ever seen before or seen since. To understand what Harmon pulled off that night, you have to know who he was before the war even started. He grew up in a small town in Tennessee, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and the biggest event of the year was the county fair. Harmon was quiet, the kind of kid who didn't say much but watched everything, and from the time he was 12 years old he could shoot better than just about anyone around him. His father taught him to hunt, but Harmon didn't just learn to hunt. He learned to read the land, to understand wind and distance and the way light moved through trees, and he turned all of that into a gift that most people can't even explain. By the time he was 16, he was entering shooting competitions across the state, and he wasn't just winning them. He was winning them by margins that made the other shooters shake their heads and wonder if they were even in the same sport. His father used to joke that the boy could hit a moving target at 500 yards and still have time to reload before anyone else in the county could figure out where the sound came from. That wasn't an exaggeration. That was just the truth about Daniel Harmon, and the truth only got sharper as he got older. When he enlisted in the Marines in 1942, his shooting scores during basic training were so high that his drill instructor pulled him aside and told him he was looking at one of the best natural marksmen the Corps had seen in years. That wasn't flattery or empty praise to boost a young recruit's confidence. That was a straight fact, backed up by every single score on his record, and the men training alongside him took notice too. There was something about the way Harmon held a rifle, something about the stillness that came over him right before he fired, that told you this wasn't just skill. It was instinct, the kind of thing you can't teach and can't fake, and it would end up saving his life on a night when nothing else could. The Marines sent him to the Pacific in early 1943, and over the next year and a half he fought on island after island, each one bloodier than the last. The fighting in the Pacific was unlike anything happening in Europe. There were no long lines of trenches or open fields where you could see the enemy coming from miles away. There was jungle, dense and dark and dripping with moisture, and the Japanese had turned every cave, every ridge, and every patch of high ground into a killing zone designed to stop the Marines cold. They fought with a ferocity and a willingness to die that American soldiers had never faced before, and the Marines learned very quickly that every single yard they took cost blood, sometimes a lot of it. Harmon fought through all of it, and somewhere along the way he earned a reputation among the men around him as someone you wanted on your side when things got ugly, because when it came to putting bullets exactly where they needed to go, there was simply nobody better. By the summer of 1944, he'd been in the Pacific for over a year, and the wear was showing. He was thinner than he'd been when he shipped out, and the rings under his eyes told you he hadn't slept a full night in months. But his hands were still steady, and his eyes were still sharp, and that mattered more than anything else when the Japanese came for him on that warm, dark night. The attack started just after midnight. Harmon had been alone in his foxhole for hours, waiting, listening to the silence that told him the enemy was gathering somewhere in the jungle just beyond his position. He'd called in on the radio, scratchy and broken as it was, and command had heard him. They knew he was out there. They knew he was wounded and alone, and they offered to send in a plane, a single aircraft that could drop supplies, ammunition, maybe even an extraction team if the timing was right. It was the kind of offer that most men in his situation would have grabbed without thinking twice, because being alone and wounded with the enemy closing in wasn't a situation anyone wanted to stay in any longer than they had to. But Harmon said no. He told them he didn't need an evacuation. What he needed was 9 rounds of ammunition dropped from the air, because he already had a plan. The radio operator on the other end of that transmission would later say he thought Harmon had lost his mind. 9 bullets against an enemy force that intelligence said could be anywhere from 50 to 100 soldiers. It sounded like a joke, the kind of thing a man with a fever and too much blood loss might say in a moment of confusion, not a real request from a Marine who meant every word of it. But Harmon wasn't confused at all. He was calculating, running through the numbers in his head the way a hunter does before a big hunt, thinking about distance and angle and timing, and by the time the radio call was done he already knew what he was going to do. He just needed those 9 rounds to do it. Here's what Harmon understood about the Japanese attack force that most people didn't, and it's the key to everything that happened next. The Imperial Japanese Army organized its fighters into squads, and each squad had a leader, a sergeant or a junior officer who gave the orders and kept the men moving forward. If you took out a squad leader, the men under him didn't just slow down. They stopped. They had no one to tell them what to do next, no one to point them in the right direction, no one to keep them from getting confused and turning on each other in the dark. It was a weakness built right into the way the Japanese military was structured, and Harmon knew it. He knew that if he could find those squad leaders, the ones giving the orders, and put a bullet in each one of them before the rest of the force even knew what was happening, the whole attack would fall apart from the inside. The ammunition drop came through just before the Japanese started moving. 9 rounds, exactly what he'd asked for, landed near enough for him to grab them in the dark. And then Harmon settled into his foxhole, wrapped his wounds as tight as he could, checked his rifle one more time, and waited. The Japanese came through the jungle in waves, the way they always did, quiet and fast and spread out across a wide front. There were about 87 of them in total, organized into 9 squads, and each squad had its own leader moving at the front. Harmon couldn't see them clearly. It was pitch black, the kind of darkness where you can't tell your hand from the air in front of your face, and the jungle made it worse by swallowing every bit of light that might have existed. But Harmon didn't need to see them clearly, because what he needed wasn't sight. He needed to hear them, needed to find the patterns in the way they moved, the rhythm of their steps, and the small sounds they made as they pushed through the underbrush, and he needed to match those sounds to the lights. And here's where his years of hunting and shooting and reading the land paid off in a way that was almost impossible to believe. Every squad leader in the Japanese force carried a small signal light, a dim little flash that they used to communicate with the men behind them in the dark, and it was a standard part of how they moved at night, a way to keep the squads coordinated when you couldn't see anything else. Those lights were tiny. They flickered for just a second at a time, and most soldiers would have missed them completely in that kind of darkness. But Harmon had spent his whole life watching for exactly that kind of thing, the small movement, the tiny flash, the detail that everyone else walks right past, and in that jungle on that night his eyes found what his ears alone could not. One by one, in the black and the silence, he found the lights, and he started counting. The first bullet went off and the sound cracked through the night like a whip. A squad leader dropped. Just like that, no warning, no drama, just a man who had been walking and then wasn't anymore. The men behind him stumbled, confused, because nobody had told them what just happened. They couldn't see the body clearly. They didn't know if it was a sniper or a whole platoon opening fire or something else entirely, and that confusion was exactly what Harmon wanted. He waited. Patience was the other weapon he carried that night, and he used it just as carefully as his rifle. He didn't fire again right away. He let the silence sit there, heavy and suffocating, and he let the Japanese soldiers scare themselves with it. Minutes passed. Then the second light flickered somewhere to his left, a different squad moving into position, and he fired again. Another squad leader went down. The confusion doubled. This went on through the long, brutal hours of that night. Harmon fired 9 times in total, spaced out over hours, and each shot hit exactly where it needed to hit. Each one took out a squad leader, and each one sent another ripple of panic through the attacking force. The Japanese soldiers didn't know where the shots were coming from. They didn't know how many Marines were out there. For all they knew, there could have been a full platoon dug into that hillside, picking them off one by one, and the silence between the shots made it worse, because a quiet enemy is a terrifying enemy when you're stumbling around in the dark trying to find him. The Japanese military had a deeply held belief in the power of the attack, in pressing forward no matter the cost, and that belief held for most of the night. Squads kept pushing, kept trying to close the distance to Harmon's position, but without their leaders they moved in the wrong directions. Some of them turned and fired into each other, mistaking their own men for the enemy in the complete darkness. Others just stopped moving, frozen in place, waiting for orders that never came because the men who were supposed to give those orders were lying on the ground with bullets in their chests. The attack that was supposed to overwhelm a single wounded Marine turned into something else entirely. It turned into 9 squads of men tearing themselves apart because the one person holding each of them together was gone. By the time the first gray light of dawn started creeping through the jungle canopy, the shooting had stopped. Not because Harmon ran out of ammunition, though he did, and not because the Japanese pulled back in an organized retreat, because they didn't. It stopped because there was no one left to shoot. The attack force that had moved through that jungle with the intention of killing one wounded American had destroyed itself, and when the Marine reinforcements finally pushed through the trees to find Harmon's foxhole, what they saw stopped them cold. 87 bodies. Some of them had been killed by Harmon's bullets, the 9 shots that had been placed with such precision that each one had done exactly what it was supposed to do. But most of them hadn't been killed by Harmon at all. They had been killed by each other, in the dark and the confusion, by their own rifles and bayonets, because when you take away the people who are supposed to be leading you and you can't see anything and every sound around you feels like a threat, you start shooting at anything that moves. And everything around them moved. Harmon was barely conscious when they found him. He was slumped against the wall of his foxhole, his bandages soaked through with blood, his rifle still in his lap with the bolt pulled back and the magazine empty. His face was white, his breathing was shallow, and for a few terrible seconds the Marines who reached him weren't sure if he was still alive. But he was. He opened his eyes, looked at the men standing over him, and from what the story goes, the first thing he said was something close to, "Did I get them all?" It wasn't cocky. It wasn't bragging. It was just a question, the same way a hunter might ask after a long night in the woods, calm and quiet and completely serious. They got him to a field hospital within the hour, and the doctors there had to work on him for a long time before they were sure he was going to make it. The wounds were bad, the kind of bad that made experienced surgeons go quiet and focus on their work without saying a word, and the blood loss alone should have made it impossible for him to do what he did that night. The fact that he'd sat in that foxhole for hours, completely alone, firing with that kind of accuracy while his body was slowly shutting down, was something that the medical staff talked about for days afterward. They'd seen a lot of wounded Marines by that point in the war, and they'd seen men do extraordinary things while they were hurt, men who fought on with broken bones and bullets still in them because giving up simply wasn't something they were willing to do. But what Harmon had done was different. It wasn't just bravery and it wasn't just toughness, though he had plenty of both. It was something colder and sharper than either of those things, something that required a mind that kept working perfectly even when everything around it was falling apart, and that kind of thing is rare in any war. The story of what happened that night spread through the Marine Corps faster than almost any other single event from the Pacific Campaign. Word of mouth carried it from unit to unit, island to island, and by the time it reached the higher ranks it had already become something close to legend. Some of the details changed as it traveled, the way stories always do when they pass from one man to the next, but the core of it stayed the same. One wounded man in a foxhole. 9 bullets and a plan that worked perfectly. 87 men who came to kill him and never left that jungle alive. And a lesson that officers who studied the fight would carry with them for the rest of the war, about what happens when you underestimate a single soldier who knows more about the battlefield than you do. Harmon recovered from his wounds, though it took months of careful work by the doctors before they cleared him to go back, and when he did he went back to the Pacific before the war ended. He didn't become famous in the way that some Marines did, didn't end up on the covers of magazines or in the newsreels that played in American movie theaters. He was the kind of man who didn't want that. He just wanted to do his job and come home, and eventually he did both. But the men who fought alongside him never forgot what he did, and the officers who studied what happened that night learned something important about how wars are actually won. It's not always about numbers. It's not always about firepower or tanks or planes or the size of your army. Sometimes it's about one person who understands the situation better than everyone else in the room, one person who sees the thing that nobody else sees, and one person who has the nerve and the skill to act on it when everything is falling apart around them. Daniel Harmon was that person on that night, and the 96 seconds of total firing time it took him to end the fight became one of the quietest and deadliest moments in the entire Pacific War. By the end of the war, the Marines had fought across dozens of islands, from Guadalcanal to Iwo Jima, and they'd seen incredible acts of courage and skill at every single one of them. But the story that keeps coming back, the one that Marines still talk about when they gather and swap stories from the old days, is the one about the wounded man in the foxhole who looked at 87 enemies closing in and didn't ask for more guns or more men or more time. He asked for 9 bullets, and 9 bullets turned out to be all he needed to end a fight that should have killed him. That's the part that sticks with people, the part that stays in your head long after you've heard it, because it reminds you that in the middle of a war where millions of men were fighting with everything they had, sometimes the most dangerous person on the battlefield wasn't the one with the most firepower. Sometimes it was the one who thought the clearest. Thanks for watching this one. If you want more stories like this, the kind that make you sit back and wonder how any of it was even possible, hit subscribe because we're putting out a new one every single week. And trust me, there are plenty more where that came from. Next time we're going deep into another fight from the Pacific that most people have never even heard of, and it's going to be just as wild as this one. Don't miss it.